So there I was, about to tell you the story of how one human, with a wrench and zero common sense, accidentally broke the most sacred law in galactic history. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how perfectly organized the galaxy was before Jake Martinez showed up. The Galactic Council had spent 3,000 years building what they called the ultimate system of cosmic order. And by ultimate, I mean absolutely mind-numbingly bureaucratic. These beings had turned survival of the fittest into an actual legal framework, complete with forms, stamps, and a waiting period that could outlast most solar cycles. At the top of this magnificent house of cards sat Ambassador Crix, a four-armed purple creature who looked like someone had crossed a squid with a filing cabinet and given it delusions of grandeur. Crix had dedicated his entire existence to maintaining what he called the Survival Code, a law so sacred that even thinking about breaking it required 3 permits and a background check. The Survival Code was beautifully simple in its cruelty. If your species was classified as genetically inferior, tough luck. No help, no assistance, no basic decency. Natural selection would handle the rest, thank you very much. The Council had spent centuries categorizing every known species into neat little boxes labeled either evolutionarily viable or cosmic dead weight. Now, humans had somehow squeezed into the viable category, probably because we'd already blown up half our planet and were still kicking. The Council found this both impressive and deeply disturbing. They gave us maintenance jobs on their space stations, figuring we were too stupid to cause real trouble. Enter Jake Martinez, a guy from New Mexico who'd signed up for interstellar maintenance work because, and I quote, "the benefits package was decent, and nobody told me I'd have to learn 17 different alien toilet systems." Jake spent his days crawling through ventilation shafts, replacing air filters, and wondering why every alien species insisted on designing their technology like abstract art projects. On the morning that would change galactic law forever, Jake was doing exactly what he'd been doing for 2 years. Fixing things. Specifically, he was wedged inside a maintenance shaft on level 7 of Council Station, wrestling with an air filter that had apparently been installed by someone with 6 thumbs and a grudge against basic engineering principles. "Come on, you oversized lint prap," Jake muttered, giving the filter his signature percussive maintenance technique. That's when he heard it. A sound that definitely wasn't supposed to be coming from inside a ventilation system. A soft, desperate squeaking that made his chest do that annoying thing where it felt all tight and concerned. Jake paused, wrenched halfway to the filter, and listened. There it was again. Something small and scared was making that noise, and it was coming from deeper in the shaft system. Now, any sensible person would have reported it to the proper authorities and filled out the appropriate forms. Jake Martinez had never been accused of being sensible. He started crawling toward the sound, dragging his tool bag behind him, and muttering about how his job description definitely hadn't mentioned rescue operations. The squeaking got louder as he moved, and Jake found himself making those ridiculous cooing sounds that humans make at anything small and helpless, regardless of how many tentacles it might have. What Jake didn't know, as he crawled through that shaft with his heart doing stupid human things like caring about random noises, was that Ambassador Crix was 3 levels up, reviewing the daily reports and feeling particularly smug about the galaxy's perfect order. In about 10 minutes, both of their days were going to get significantly more complicated. The squeaking was getting desperate now, and Jake picked up his pace, because apparently evolution had wired humans to respond to distress calls from species they'd never even met. Who knew? Jake rounded a corner in the ventilation shaft and found himself face to face with what could only be described as a tiny alien cotton ball with eyes. The creature was about the size of a hamster, covered in silver poop fur that shimmered like starlight and currently wedged between 2 metal plates, with all the dignity of a sock stuck in a vacuum cleaner. "Well, hello there, little guy," Jake said, because talking to trapped alien creatures was apparently just another Tuesday for him now. The cotton ball looked up with enormous purple eyes that immediately activated every protective instinct Jake didn't know he had. Great. Just great. The creature squeaked again, and Jake could practically hear it saying, "Help me," in whatever language tiny space hamsters spoke. He pulled out his tablet and ran a quick species scan, because even reckless humans know you should probably identify something before you stick your hand near it. The results made Jake's stomach drop. Zephyrian. Classification, genetically inferior. Status, evolution, dead end. Assistance, level, prohibited by galactic law. "Oh, come on," Jake muttered. "You're telling me this little furball is supposed to be left for dead because some committee decided it's not genetically worthy? That's the dumbest thing I've heard since they tried to explain quantum taxation to me." The Zephyrian squeaked pitifully, and Jake made the kind of decision that had gotten humans both kicked out of paradise and invited to join the galactic community. He ignored the law completely. "Okay, Pip," Jake said, because the creature needed a name and it was making Pip-like sounds. "Let's get you out of there before I remember I'm supposed to be smart about this stuff." What followed was 15 minutes of the most ridiculous rescue operation in galactic history. Jake used his multi-tool to carefully pry apart the metal plates, fed Pip half a protein bar to keep the little guy calm, and when that didn't work, started singing an off-key version of My Way, because apparently that's what his brain decided would be helpful. "I did it my way," Jake crooned, working the metal loose while Pip stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Which, let's be honest, he probably had. The singing worked, though. Pip calmed down enough for Jake to ease him free, and within minutes the tiny Zephyrian was perched on Jake's shoulder, purring like a miniature engine and probably violating about 17 different health codes. That's when Ambassador Crix chose to make his appearance. "What?" came a horrified voice from behind them. "In the name of cosmic order is happening here?" Jake turned around, still crammed in the ventilation shaft with an illegal alien sitting on his shoulder, to find Ambassador Crix staring at him through an access panel. The ambassador's forearms were crossed in what Jake was pretty sure was the universal gesture for, "You are in so much trouble." "Oh, hey there," Jake said with the kind of casual friendliness that made aliens question human survival instincts. "Just doing some routine maintenance. You know how it is." Crix's purple skin turned a shade that Jake's colorblind eyes couldn't quite identify but figured probably meant apoplectic rage. "Routine maintenance does not involve harboring genetically inferior species," Crix sputtered. "That creature is classified as evolutionary dead weight. You are in direct violation of Code 777 of the survival statutes." "Code what now?" Jake asked, scratching Pip behind what he assumed were ears. The Zephyrian purred louder. "You have interfered with natural selection," Crix continued, his voice climbing toward frequencies only dolphins could hear. "That creature was meant to perish. It is the cosmic order. It is the law." Jake looked at Pip, who was now grooming his tiny paws with the focus of someone who had just discovered personal hygiene. Then he looked back at Crix, who appeared to be having some kind of bureaucratic seizure. "Yeah, well," Jake said, "sometimes the cosmic order can kiss my cosmic rear end." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the exact moment that Jake Martinez accidentally declared war on 3,000 years of galactic jurisprudence. Within 6 hours, Jake found himself sitting in a detention cell that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd heard about comfort secondhand and decided it was probably overrated. Pip, meanwhile, had somehow convinced the guards that he was evidence and therefore couldn't be separated from Jake. The little furball was currently napping in Jake's jacket pocket, occasionally sticking his head out to chirp at passing aliens like he was on vacation. "This is insane," Jake told the gray wall, because talking to inanimate objects was apparently his coping mechanism now. "I saved a hamster and now I'm public enemy number 1. The insanity was just getting started." Jake's arrest had somehow become the lead story on Galactic News Network, with the headline reading, "Human violates sacred law. Cosmic balance in jeopardy." They'd interviewed 17 different species about the unprecedented crisis, and Jake was pretty sure none of them actually knew what they were talking about. Enter Judge Vorthon, an ancient tree-like being who moved like he was powered by geological time and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through a library. Vorthon had been appointed to preside over what the media was calling the trial of the millennium, which Jake thought was a bit dramatic for a maintenance issue. "The defendant stands accused," Vorthon began, his words falling like autumn leaves made of legal jargon, "of willful interference with natural evolutionary processes, violation of species classification protocols, and undermining the fundamental order of cosmic selection." Jake raised his hand. "Your Honor, I pulled a stuck hamster out of an air vent. Can we maybe dial back the cosmic drama?" The courtroom, which was packed with reporters and curious aliens, erupted in shocked whispers. Apparently calling ancient legal proceedings cosmic drama was not standard courtroom etiquette. The prosecutor, a needle-thin creature called Advocate Zinth, stood up with the kind of righteous fury usually reserved for parking violations. "Your Honor, the defendant's casual attitude toward this matter only proves the depth of his crime. The accused has disrupted the natural order that has governed our galaxy for millennia by saving a hamster," Jake repeated, because apparently he was the only one who found this ridiculous. "A genetically inferior specimen," Zinth corrected, waving a tentacle dramatically. "The Zephyrian species has been classified as an evolutionary dead end for over 2 centuries. By interfering with this creature's natural demise, the defendant has thrown the entire system of cosmic balance into chaos." From Jake's pocket, Pip poked his head out and made a sound that Jake was pretty sure translated to, "Did this guy just call me worthless?" The little Zephyrian fixed Zinth with a stare that could have melted hull plating. "Further," Zinth continued, apparently immune to being judged by small mammals. The defendant's actions have inspired copycat crimes across 17 systems. Reports are flooding in of beings helping other beings, regardless of their genetic classification. The natural order is collapsing. Jake blinked. Wait, people are being nice to each other because I helped Pip? And this is bad because why, exactly? Judge Vortan's branches rustled ominously. The accused will address the court with proper respect for the gravity of these proceedings. Your Honor, Jake said, making an effort to sound official. With all due respect, I think you might be overthinking this whole situation. The court stenographer, a multi-eyed creature taking notes at light speed, actually stopped typing. In 3,000 years of galactic law, apparently no one had ever suggested that the court was overthinking anything. Pip chose that moment to climb out of Jake's pocket, waddle across the defendant's table, and start grooming himself with the confidence of someone who'd never heard of courtroom decorum. Half the gallery pulled out their phones to take pictures, because apparently tiny law-breaking mammals were good for social media engagement. The evidence, Jake announced, pointing at Pip, is adorable, and clearly not a threat to cosmic order. And with that statement, Jake Martinez managed to reduce the most serious legal proceeding in galactic history to a debate about whether cute counted as a legal defense. The next morning brought Jake's court-appointed lawyer, Attorney Blixen, a slug-like creature who oozed into the courtroom 20 minutes late and immediately started complaining about the temperature. Blixen had the kind of professional demeanor that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else, preferably somewhere with better snack options. So, Blixen said, not looking up from what appeared to be a menu on his tablet. You're the human who broke the survival code. Fascinating. Do you know if the courthouse cafeteria serves anything without chlorophyll? I'm on a strict non-photosynthetic diet. Jake stared at his legal representation. Are you seriously thinking about lunch right now? I'm facing cosmic crimes charges. Oh, the cosmic crimes thing. Blixen waved a slimy appendage dismissively. Look, Martinez, here's some free advice. Plead guilty, express deep remorse, maybe cry a little if humans do that, and they'll probably only exile you to a mining colony for 50 years. Now, about that cafeteria situation, that's when Jake realized he was going to have to defend himself, because apparently the universe had decided that comedy was more important than competent legal counsel. Your Honor, Jake announced, standing up as court resumed. I'd like to represent myself. Judge Vorthan's branches creaked ominously. The defendant wishes to engage in pro se representation. This is highly irregular. Yeah, well, so is arresting someone for basic decency, Jake replied. But here we are. Prosecutor Zinth practically vibrated with excitement. Going up against a self-represented human was probably like Christmas morning for prosecutorial careers. Your Honor, Jake began, and he could hear his mother's voice in his head telling him to stand up straight and speak clearly. I want to tell you a story about a Tuesday morning and a stuck hamster. The court recognizes that Zephyrians are not hamsters, Zinth interrupted. Fine, a stuck space hamster, Jake corrected. I was doing my job, fixing air filters, when I heard something in distress. Now where I come from, when you hear something scared and trapped, you help it. That's not a law or a regulation, it's just what decent people do. The gallery murmured, because apparently the concept of helping without checking classification codes first was revolutionary. The prosecution wants you to believe that I disrupted some cosmic balance, Jake continued, warming to his theme. But let me ask you something. What kind of balance requires leaving small, helpless creatures to die alone in ventilation shafts? From the evidence table, Pip squeaked supportively, and Jake was pretty sure he'd just gained his first character witness. The defendant oversimplifies complex evolutionary science, Zinth objected. Do I? Jake asked. Because I've been reading up on this classification system of yours, and it's fascinating stuff. He pulled out his tablet, which Blixen had abandoned in favor of what looked like a sandwich catalog. According to these records, Zephyrians were classified as genetically inferior in 2847. Following a comprehensive study by the Committee for Evolutionary Assessment, Judge Vorden leaned forward, his bark creaking with interest. The defendant has researched the classification protocols? Oh, I did more than research them, Jake said with a grin that would have worried anyone who knew him well. I found the original study. You want to know why Zephyrians are considered evolutionary dead ends? The courtroom went dead silent. Even Blixen looked up from his lunch plans. Because, Jake announced, some genius on the committee 200 years ago filed the report under Zephyrians instead of Zephirites. They classified the wrong species. You could have heard a pin drop if pins made noise when they dropped in artificial gravity. Zinth's needle-thin frame went rigid. The Zephyrine evaluation was actually supposed to be about Zephirites, a species of crystalline rocks from the Vega system. Jake continued, clearly enjoying himself now. Rocks, Your Honor. They classified rocks as genetically inferior, and somehow applied that classification to an entire sentient species by mistake. Judge Vorthen's branches began rustling like a forest in a windstorm. This is a serious accusation, defended Martinez. It gets better, Jake said. Pip here isn't just cute. He's smart. Watch this. He pulled a small puzzle cube from his pocket, one of those brain teaser toys that came in the station's gift shop. He set it in front of Pip, who immediately began manipulating it with his tiny paws. Within 30 seconds, Pip had solved a puzzle that typically took most species several minutes to figure out. The little Zephyrian looked up at the courtroom with obvious pride, chittering happily. The prosecution's case, Jake said, is based on a filing error and maintained by bureaucrats who never bothered to double-check their work. Meanwhile, I've got a supposedly genetically inferior hamster who just schooled half this courtroom in spatial reasoning. The gallery erupted. Reporters were frantically taking notes, aliens were arguing loudly in 17 different languages, and Ambassador Crix looked like someone had just told him that all his forms had been filed in the wrong color ink. Furthermore, Jake continued, because apparently he was on a roll, if helping someone in need is a crime, then your whole system is built on cruelty disguised as science. And frankly, Your Honor, that's not a system worth preserving. Pip chose that moment to solve another puzzle, this one even faster than the first, while simultaneously giving what could only be described as a smug look to the prosecution table. The defendant raises troubling questions about our classification methodology, Judge Vorthen admitted, his voice like wind through dying leaves. I raise one simple question, Jake corrected. When did helping someone become wrong? Because where I come from, we've got a saying, you judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members. And right now, Your Honor, you're failing that test pretty spectacularly. In the stunned silence that followed, Pip squeaked once, softly, and somehow managed to make it sound like mic drop. What happened next could only be described as the most spectacular bureaucratic meltdown in galactic history. It started with a single voice from the gallery. Wait a minute, called out a blue tentacled being from the third row. If they got the Zephyrians wrong, what about us Aquarians? We've been classified as moisture-dependent weaklings for 3 centuries. Judge Vorthen's bark cracked audibly. The court will maintain order. Order? Shouted another voice, this one belonging to a crystalline creature that sparkled when it moved. They classified my entire species as decorative minerals in 2756. We've been denied citizenship rights because some committee thought we were fancy rocks. The courtroom erupted into chaos that made Jake's earlier disruption look like a library discussion. Beings were standing up everywhere, waving appendages and shouting about their own species classifications. The court reporter had given up taking notes and was just recording everything, probably for the historical archives and future comedy specials. Ambassador Crix, looking like someone had just told him that all his beloved forms had been printed on toilet paper, stood up desperately. Citizens, please, the classification system has maintained galactic peace for millennia. We cannot simply abandon established protocols because of one human's accusations. Home human's facts, Jake corrected cheerfully, while Pip preened on the defendant's table like he knew he was the star of the show. The system isn't perfect, Crix continued, his purple skin now approaching ultraviolet levels of distress. But it provides structure, order. Without it, we would have chaos. Your Honor, interrupted a voice from the back of the courtroom. The speaker was a small gray being with enormous eyes who Jake recognized as one of the court clerks. I've been running database queries during the proceedings, and I've found 17 more classification errors in the past hour alone. Judge Vorthen's branches began shedding leaves at an alarming rate. 17? So far, the clerk continued, pulling up holographic displays that filled the air with data. The Melodians were classified as noise pollutants instead of cultural artists. The Builders Guild was listed as compulsive stackers rather than architectural engineers. And apparently someone classified the entire philosopher species as professional arguers. Well, Jake said, that last one might actually be accurate. A being who was presumably a philosopher stood up indignantly. We prefer practitioners of intellectual discourse, thank you very much. See? Jake grinned. The revelations kept coming like a bureaucratic avalanche. Species after species discovered they'd been mislabeled, underestimated, or outright insulted by a classification system that apparently had the accuracy of a blindfolded dart thrower with vertigo. This is impossible, Crix sputtered, frantically shuffling through his papers like they might contain a magic solution. The Committee for Evolutionary Assessment was comprised of the galaxy's finest minds. Actually, the clerk said, pulling up another file, the committee was mostly formed by whoever showed up to the meetings. According to these records, the chairman for 30 years was someone who thought genetic diversity was a type of breakfast cereal. That's when Pip decided to add his own contribution to the chaos. The little Zephyrian had apparently been listening to everything with the attention of a tiny furry scholar, and now he was chittering in what sounded suspiciously like organized patterns. "Is he," Jake asked, watching Pip gesticulate with his tiny paws, "is he trying to communicate something specific?" A linguistics expert in the gallery who'd been frantically taking notes suddenly gasped. "He's speaking. The Zephyrian is using complex grammatical structures. This species isn't just intelligent, they might be linguistically gifted." Pip, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight, proceeded to demonstrate his point by picking up Jake's stylus and drawing a perfect mathematical equation on the tablet's screen. It was a solution to faster-than-light travel that had been puzzling galactic engineers for decades. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of several hundred beings realizing they'd been catastrophically wrong about everything. "Let me get this straight," Jake said, looking around at the chaos he'd accidentally unleashed. "You've been denying basic rights to species based on a classification system that's about as accurate as a coin flip, maintained by people who couldn't tell the difference between a sentient being and a decorative rock, and now you're all surprised that it might not be the foundation of cosmic justice you thought it was?" Ambassador Creeks made a sound like a deflating balloon mixed with a death rattle. "But the system, the order, the forms," Jake said gently, "are wrong. All of them. And you know what? That's okay. People make mistakes. The problem is when you build laws around those mistakes and then refuse to fix them because it's inconvenient." Pip squeaked supportively and drew another equation, this one apparently solving the unified field theory that had stumped physicists for centuries. He looked up at the courtroom with what could only be described as a "see, I told you so" expression. "Your Honor," Jake continued, "I didn't set out to break your system. I just wanted to help a scared little guy who was stuck in a pipe. But if helping someone is illegal under your laws, then maybe the problem isn't with the helping. Maybe the problem is with the laws." Judge Vorthan's branches had stopped shedding leaves and now hung still, like he was deep in thought or possibly having some kind of existential crisis. Around the courtroom, beings were talking in hushed tones, sharing stories of their own encounters with the classification system, and generally having the kind of conversations that topple governments and start revolutions. "The court," Judge Vorthan said finally, his voice like wind through autumn forests, "will need to recess to consider these new developments." "Take all the time you need," Jake said. "Pip and I will be right here, probably solving more of your unsolvable problems, and definitely not feeling sorry for accidentally breaking the galaxy." From his perch on the table, Pip chittered what sounded distinctly like laughter, and somehow managed to make it sound like the most reasonable thing anyone had said all day. 3 weeks later, Jake Martinez found himself in the most surreal situation of his already pretty surreal life. He was standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council, watching Judge Vordan ceremonially burn a 3,000-year-old law book, while Pip sat on his shoulder wearing a tiny ceremonial sash that read, "Honorary Council Advisor." The survival code was officially dead, killed by a maintenance worker with a wrench and a hamster with a PhD in making everyone look stupid. "By the power vested in me by complete bureaucratic necessity," Judge Vordan announced, his voice carrying across the hall like wind through a legal revolution, "I hereby declare the survival code null, void, and embarrassingly wrong. All species classifications are suspended pending actual scientific review by beings who know the difference between rocks and sentient life forms." The crowd cheered, which was impressive considering it included species that communicated through bioluminescence, interpretive dance, and what appeared to be aggressive sneezing. Ambassador Crix, meanwhile, had been reassigned to the Department of Forms Processing, level sub-basement 12, where his love of paperwork could flourish without affecting actual policy. Jake had heard he was surprisingly happy there, having discovered a filing system that hadn't been properly organized in 6 centuries. Some beings, it turned out, were just meant to alphabetize things. "The Council recognizes the contribution of human Jake Martinez," continued Judge Vorthan, who demonstrated that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the simplest questions. Like, why are we being terrible to small, helpless creatures? And have you people ever actually read these forms you keep filing? Jake waved awkwardly from the podium, still not entirely sure how he'd gone from fixing air filters to accidentally reforming galactic government. Pip, who had become something of a celebrity after solving 17 different scientific problems that had been stumping the galaxy's greatest minds, squeaked proudly and showed off his tiny medal. "Furthermore," Judge Vorthan added, "the Council unanimously votes to establish the Martinez Doctrine, which states that helping someone in need is not only legal, it's encouraged, regardless of their species classification, genetic status, or ability to fill out forms in triplicate. The applause was thunderous, and Jake was pretty sure he saw several beings wiping away what passed for tears among their respective species. But the real changes were happening outside the formal ceremonies. The Aquarians had established the first interspecies cultural exchange program in galactic history. The crystalline beings had formed an artists' collective and were creating sculptures that made hardened space pirates weep with joy. The Melodians had started a galaxy-wide music festival that was somehow bringing peace to 3 separate war zones through the power of really excellent harmonies. And the Zephyrians? Well, it turned out that a species everyone had written off as evolutionary dead ends were actually gifted mathematicians, linguists, and problem solvers. Universities across the galaxy were falling over themselves to offer Zephyrian professors tenure, and several major corporations had hired them as consultants for projects that had been stalled for decades. You know what the funny part is? Jake asked Pip as they walked through the corridors of Council Station, heading back toward the maintenance department. I still have no idea how half these alien toilet systems work. Pip chittered and pointed toward a restroom sign that featured symbols Jake was pretty sure weren't in any manual he'd been given. Yeah, exactly, Jake said. Save the galaxy, still can't figure out Andromedan plumbing. There's a life lesson in there somewhere. They were interrupted by a group of young aliens who'd apparently been waiting for them. There was a small blue creature, a fuzzy orange being that looked like a living teddy bear, and something that might have been a sentient plant with attitude issues. Excuse me, Mr. Martinez, said the blue one in accented galactic standard. We're from the newly formed Help Everyone initiative. We've been helping beings in need across 17 systems, inspired by your example. Could you give us some advice? Jake blinked. You want advice from me? I'm a maintenance guy who talks to hamsters. Space hamsters, corrected the fuzzy orange being helpfully. Right, space hamsters, Jake said. Look, I don't know about initiatives or movements or any of that big picture stuff. I just think that when you see someone who needs help, you help them. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. The plant creature rustled thoughtfully. But what about regulations? Proper procedures, risk assessments. What about them? Jake asked. If someone's drowning, you don't stop to check if they have their swimming permit. You pull them out of the water and worry about the paperwork later. Pip squeaked approvingly and demonstrated his point by solving a Rubik's Cube that one of the young aliens had been struggling with. The galaxy's full of beings who think that rules are more important than people, Jake continued, warming to his theme. But rules are just tools. When your tools aren't helping you build something better, you get new tools. You don't keep using a broken hammer just because it's the hammer you've always used. The young aliens exchanged glances, and Jake could practically see the light bulbs going off over their various heads, appendages, and photosynthetic surfaces. Now, if you'll excuse me, Jake said, I've got some actual work to do. These air filters don't replace themselves, and apparently keeping people breathing is still my primary job description. As the group wandered off, chattering excitedly about their mission to help everyone everywhere, Jake turned to Pip. Think we started something good here, buddy? Pip looked up at him with those enormous purple eyes and made a sound that Jake had learned meant, obviously, you magnificent disaster of a human. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past viewports that showed the vast expanse of space, and the ships of dozens of species traveling freely between worlds that had once been closed to them. Somewhere out there, beings were helping other beings without checking their genetic classifications first. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was becoming a slightly less stupid place. You know what, Pip? Jake said as they reached the maintenance bay. I think this universe might just be worth keeping around after all. Pip chittered happily, pulled out a small device he'd apparently been working on, and projected a holographic display showing improved air filtration designs that would make Jake's job about 50% easier. Now that, Jake said, grinning, is what I call a happy ending. And as they got back to work, fixing the small, essential things that kept the galaxy running, Jake Martinez couldn't help but think that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest acts of kindness, even if those acts accidentally destroy 3,000 years of bureaucratic tradition and make you the most reluctant revolutionary in galactic history. From his perch on Jake's tool cart, Pip squeaked once more, and somehow managed to make it sound like mission accomplished.